They were the last people anyone expected to fear. White uniforms, soft voices, hands trained to protect. But beneath those calm smiles lurked loyalty to a system built on purity through murder. As the Nazi regime expanded, hospitals became hunting grounds. Patients who needed care, children with disabilities, wounded soldiers, the mentally ill, were labeled unworthy of life. And the nurses who once swore to heal now injected poison into tiny veins. They starved the weak. They stood by as gas filled the rooms. These women didn't kill in chaos like soldiers on a battlefield. Their crimes were cold, calculated, done in silence behind hospital doors. They kept charts, they smiled at families, and at night they erased thousands from existence. They called it mercy. History calls it medical murder. Tonight we enter the hidden world of the Nazi nurses, where healing hands became instruments of death. Before the Second World War, a nurse was a symbol of compassion, a guardian of the weak, a protector of life. But inside Adolf Hitler's Germany, everything changed. From their first day of training, young women in white uniforms were told a new commandment. Germany's health is more important than any single human life. Hospitals became tools of the state. Medicine became a weapon. Nurses became the gatekeepers of racial purity. Classrooms that once taught healing now rang with lessons about genetics, eugenics, and how to identify defective lives. Charts divided people into two categories, worthy of life and unworthy. Those who were weak, disabled, mentally ill, unwanted, were marked for death, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the regime believed they did not fit into the future of the perfect Aryan race. Hitler's doctors designed the policies, but it was the nurses who carried them out. Day after day, they walked into children's wards with soft smiles and deadly orders. They noted who failed to speak, who stumbled when walking, who struggled to understand. A mark in a file was enough to seal a fate. Some nurses whispered comforting lies. "You're going to a special clinic where you'll get better." But there was no clinic, no help, just death. They administered overdoses as if they were medicine. They withheld food until bodies could no longer fight. They escorted patients into rooms where carbon monoxide gas hissed through hidden pipes. And when parents begged for their children, nurses told them they had passed away from natural illness. Death certificates were forged. Tiny graves contained no names. This was their most chilling transformation. They made murder look like healthcare. Inside hospitals like Hadamar, Sonnenstein, and Brandenburg, nurses worked side by side with the killing machinery of the Third Reich. They labeled mass murder as treatment. Many believed they were doing the right thing. They were praised as patriots, guardians of Germany's strength, heroes of the future. Their uniforms stayed spotless, their hands steady, their hearts hardened. And when the war finally turned against Germany, they didn't run. They stayed until the last victims were gone, because by then they didn't see people anymore. They saw problems to be eliminated. These women were not monsters from birth. They were ordinary nurses, trained to embrace extraordinary cruelty. This is how healing hands became instruments of genocide, not on the battlefield, but in clean rooms, behind closed hospital doors, where the killing was silent and efficient. These women did not step into evil overnight. It happened slowly, lesson by lesson, oath by oath, not through fear, but through belief. They volunteered, young, ambitious, eager to prove their worth to the fatherland. To them, nursing wasn't simply a job. It was a mission to protect the future of Germany. Inside training academies, the walls dripped with propaganda. Portraits of Hitler looked down like a guardian of truth. Every classroom echoed with one message: the strong must live, the weak must die. In other countries, nurses were shown how to comfort a crying child, but here they were shown films of disabled children labeled as burdens, their existence measured in cost, not love. Professors didn't talk about saving lives. They talked about economics, how much food a mentally ill person wasted, how many healthy families could live instead. The math of murder was taught him as if it were science. Charts calculated the price of allowing the unfit to survive. Slideshows displayed human beings reduced to numbers compared to cattle, parasites, and disease. And the nurses listened, took notes, raised their hands proudly to answer the question, who deserves to live? Their textbooks had changed. No longer anatomy diagrams and first aid rules, but diagrams of skull shapes, racial purity charts, and lists of undesirable traits. On the first page, stamped in bright red ink, Lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. They memorized this term as if it were a medical diagnosis. During inspections, nurses were expected to show absolute loyalty, not just to their patients, but to Hitler himself. They practiced saluting as part of hospital routine. They sang nationalistic songs during morning rounds. They learned to spot the weak with a single glance. And when doubt surfaced, when someone whispered, "But isn't this wrong?" teachers silenced them with chilling logic. A good nurse must be strong enough to take life, if it means saving the nation. Soon, they no longer hesitated. They believed they were soldiers, fighting a biological war. Every injection they gave, every name they crossed off a list, became an act of patriotism. After months of indoctrination, they were handed pristine white uniforms, clean, perfect, a symbol not of healing, but of power. They left training halls with heads held high, not corrupted by cruelty, but convinced by ideology. They had been transformed, not into killers with rage in their hearts, but into believers who thought they were helping humanity. This was the true horror of the Third Reich's medical machine. They didn't need to turn nurses into monsters. They only needed to convince them they were heroes. When these women walked into hospitals, they carried more than syringes and charts. They carried a promise to erase whoever stood in the way of the Aryan future. That was the poison in their minds, a poison delivered not by force, but by trust. Because nothing is more terrifying than a murderer who thinks she is saving the world. It began not with the roar of cannons or the crack of rifles, but with the quiet click of a locked door. It started with silence. The first to be taken were the children, those born with disabilities, illnesses, or who were simply deemed different. Their parents were fed soothing lies. Your child is going to a special clinic for advanced therapy. We can help them. But behind those closed doors, there was no treatment. There was only selection. Doctors and nurses, the very people sworn to heal, compiled lists. Each name was a life they had judged as unworthy of living. A file was stamped, a signature was added, and a human being was reduced to a project. Across Germany and its occupied territories, hospitals morphed into killing centers disguised as clinics. Operating rooms became death chambers. The gentle touch of a nurse became the hand that delivered the final, fatal dose. Some children were given lethal injections, morphine or scopolamine disguised as medicine. Others were methodically starved, their small bodies wasting away day by day until they no longer had the strength to cry. The nurses documented every lost pound, every fading heartbeat, as if it were just routine medical procedure. But it wasn't just the children. Adults judged mentally unstable, the disabled and the elderly who could no longer contribute to the workforce, they were marked for death too. The official records used cold, dehumanizing language, unproductive, a burden to the state, lacking value. Words were sharpened into weapons. Locals whispered about the grey buses, the ambulances that arrived without sirens, their windows painted over to hide the terrified faces inside. These buses transported people to their final, unscheduled appointment. At these facilities, gas taps were installed in rooms designed to look like showers. Carbon monoxide, a silent killer, was pumped through pipes engineered by medical staff who had once taken an oath to protect life. The bodies were removed before families could visit, and death certificates were forged with fabricated causes. And the people who committed these atrocities, they went home, hung up their white coats and slept soundly. They were convinced they had done something noble. The program was given a code name, Action T4. It was a bureaucratic term for the systematic elimination of anyone considered life unworthy of life. Between 1939 and 1945, this program claimed the lives of over 300,000 people. They weren't killed by soldiers on a battlefield, but by nurses and caretakers, the people society trusted with its most vulnerable. Their weapons were not rifles, but syringes, clipboards, and hospital beds. If a nurse hesitated, if they dared to ask, Why must this child die? The answer was always soft, almost comforting. You are ending their suffering. This is an act of mercy. Think of the future of Germany. In this twisted logic, compassion was warped into cruelty, and obedience was hailed as the highest virtue. Some even took pride in their work, believing they were cleansing the nation, as if scrubbing away a stain. This was the chilling blueprint for industrialized murder. It was the dress rehearsal for the horrors that would follow. The camps, the gas chambers, the mountains of ash. The Holocaust didn't begin with guns and soldiers. It began with a pen, a doctor's signature, and a nurse who was convinced she was doing the right thing. Evil didn't arrive wearing a monster's mask. It wore a friendly smile and a clean white coat. They called it euthanasia, a mercy to end suffering. But there was no mercy here, only efficiency and silence. Inside these hospitals, nurses perfected a new kind of murder, one that looked gentle from the outside. No screaming, no blood. Just a quiet room and a slowly fading heartbeat. Patients were recorded as treated. Their charts were updated daily. But the treatment was poison, carefully measured, clinically administered. Some received lethal injections, morphine, phenol, even gasoline blended as medicine, enough to end a life but small enough to claim it was just illness. Others were placed into starvation wards. Meals became smaller each day until food disappeared completely. Their bodies weakened, their voices disappeared, and the nurses simply wrote, "No appetite, poor condition." It looked like healthcare. It was execution. Disturbingly, many of these nurses kept pets, cats, birds, rabbits, creatures they adored and fed with tenderness. Yet the patients in their care were treated with less compassion than animals. Why? Because the system taught them that these humans were not worth compassion. They sterilized young women so they would never bear children. They performed painful experiments because abnormal bodies were meant to be tested, not respected. And as they destroyed life, the world outside was led to believe they were saving it. Hospital directors demanded efficiency. How many beds were freed this week? How many mouths no longer needed feeding? How much money was saved? Each death was a statistic they celebrated. Meetings were held to praise nurses who euthanized the most cases. Awards were given. Promotions were granted. Success in this twisted reality was measured in bodies. But behind every number there was a story. A child holding a nurse's hand, trusting she would help, not knowing she was delivering the final injection. A mother forced onto a restraint bed because she begged to stay alive for her daughter. An elderly man who once fought for his country, now reduced to a waste of resources. Every life was judged by its usefulness. Can you work? Can you serve the Reich? If not, the decision was already made for you. Nurses documented these mercy killings with elegant handwriting and clean uniforms. At the end of their shift, they removed their gloves, washed their hands, and went home to eat dinner as if nothing had happened. No guilt, no nightmares, only the chilling belief that they had done something righteous. Sometimes a patient didn't die fast enough. They would gasp for air, clinging to life with sheer will. But help never came. Instead, a pillow might be pressed down, or a blanket pulled too tightly, and the struggle would end. The nurses would walk away, leaving the room in a cold stillness. If a grieving parent asked, "What happened to my child?" a nurse would answer with a practiced, kind tone, "It was painless." God took them peacefully. Every lie was delivered with a gentle smile. This reveals a dangerous truth. Evil becomes truly unstoppable when people convince themselves they are doing good. These women weren't all forced. Most had choices, and most stayed willingly. They stood next to doctors who played God, deciding a person's value, assigning their fate. The Hippocratic Oath commands, "Do no harm." But they followed a different oath. Do what the Führer commands. The world has always trusted nurses to heal the vulnerable, but in the darkest corners of these hospitals, death wore a nurse's hat and walked the halls with polished shoes and quiet footsteps. Mercy became murder. They were supposed to save lives, but some women in white coats became more feared than any soldier with a gun. Their tools weren't rifles, but syringes, poisons, and the chilling authority of medicine. Among the tens of thousands of female medical staff serving the Reich, a few names became symbols of pure clinical brutality. The most notorious was a young woman whose beauty only magnified the horror of her actions. Her name was Irma Grace. She joined the SS in her late teens, barely an adult, but within just a few years she became known throughout Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen as the Beautiful Beast. Prisoners whispered her name with terror. She wore polished boots, carried a whip, and smiled through the screams. Witnesses say she took pleasure in choosing who would suffer next, selecting victims like items on a menu. If a woman looked too weak, she was sent to the gas chambers. If she looked too strong, Irma would break her. She fed starving prisoners to her dogs, shot women for collapsing from exhaustion, and forced girls to undress so she could humiliate and beat them. One survivor described her eyes as blue, but dead inside, as if nothing human lived behind them. Irma Grace treated death like a sport, and she was rewarded for it, promoted rapidly by the SS. But the war ended, and so did her power. Captured by the British at Bergen-Belsen, she stood on trial, still smiling. The world waited for a sign of remorse, but she showed none. At just 22 years old, Irma Grace was executed for crimes against humanity, the youngest woman to face the gallows for Nazi war atrocities. Her name lives on as a reminder that evil can wear a beautiful face. But if Irma was the face of cruelty, then Hermine Braunsteiner was its iron heel. She was known as the Stomping Mare, and that title was not a metaphor. Survivors from Majdanek concentration camp remembered her boots because those boots crushed bones. She didn't just strike prisoners, she kicked them with such force that legs would snap. Children were her favorite targets. Women begged her to show mercy, but their pleas only made her attacks more violent. She dragged children by their hair, threw them onto trucks heading toward the gas chambers, and if they resisted, she beat them until silence was the only sound left. After the war, she escaped to America, married and became a housewife in New York, her past buried beneath a quiet suburban life. Until a journalist recognized her, the truth came crashing back. She was deported, tried in Germany, and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of thousands. Hermine Braunsteiner proves something terrifying. A killer can hide behind the appearance of normalcy, a neighbor, a wife, someone you would never suspect. Then there were the nurses of Hadamar. Not one woman, not two, but an entire team carrying out executions as part of their daily routine. Hadamar was a medical facility, but no one came out alive. Here, the killing was organized, efficient, and silent. Nurses filled out death certificates while secretly injecting lethal doses of morphine or cyanide. They escorted terrified children into showers, knowing gas would fill the room instead of water. They did it day after day, until murder no longer felt like murder, it was just another shift. They called it euthanasia, but the patients weren't terminally ill. They were disabled, mentally ill, or simply considered unfit by the Nazi regime. The nurses were trained to believe that some lives were not worth living, and once that belief took root, they didn't hesitate to end those lives. Some argued they had no choice, that they were just following orders. But the truth is darker. They believed in what they were doing. They thought killing was a form of healing, a service to the nation. Many of these women were never prosecuted. They returned to society, changed their names, and worked in hospitals again, saving lives in the very same profession where they once destroyed them. Irma Grace, Hermine Braunsteiner, the silent assassins of Hadamar. They reveal a horrifying truth. When a system convinces ordinary people that some humans do not deserve to exist, even nurses can become executioners. Because evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, "It's for the greater good." The scariest monsters of war are not always the ones dressed for battle, but the ones who look like healers and hold the power of life and death in their hands. When the guns fell silent and the camps were liberated, the world expected justice. We imagine war criminals dragged into courtrooms, their crimes laid bare under the weight of evidence. We imagine punishment, closure. But the truth is, many of the women who turned medicine into murder simply walked away. At the Nuremberg trials, only a small number of doctors and nurses stood accused. Most of them defended themselves with 5 words. "I was just following orders." Those 5 words became a shield that worked for many. Some female nurses who injected poisons, who selected children for gas chambers, who watched people die under their care were acquitted, as if wiping off their white coats could also wipe away the blood. The world wanted to forget. Families wanted to rebuild. Governments needed hospitals staffed again. So the same nurses who once killed returned to caring for the sick, wearing clean uniforms over the darkest past imaginable. In 1950s Germany, a doctor's coat became more valuable than a prison sentence. There were nurses who helped murder thousands in the T4 euthanasia program, yet after the war, many found work again, treating patients in the very system where they once destroyed them. Imagine entering a clinic, trusting a smiling nurse with your life, not knowing she once decided who lived and who died, based on a checklist created by a dictator. Justice was selective. The infamous ones, the names the world could not ignore, they faced their judgment. Irma Grese was executed. Hermine Braunsteiner was imprisoned years later. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. Records reveal horrifying cases that were dismissed for lack of evidence, despite surviving witnesses and documented orders. Why? Because proving murder in a system built on murder was nearly impossible. Victims burned into ash, documents destroyed, survivors too traumatized or too sick to speak. And even when punishment came, it often came late. Some nurses spent their youth committing atrocities, then spent the rest of their lives free, growing old peacefully while the children they killed never got to grow up at all. There's a story of one nurse from Hadamar who confessed she had once killed a little girl simply because the child cried too much. She served 2 years in prison, 2 years for the life of a child. Another nurse personally injected hundreds with lethal doses during night shifts. Her sentence, 3 years. By the time she left prison, she was still young enough to start a new career in healthcare. Some women who forced prisoners into gas chambers claimed they thought it was therapy, and courts believed them. The legal system simply wasn't ready to understand the scale of their silent crimes. There were no blood-soaked weapons, no gunfire, just paperwork and poison, and that made their guilt easier to deny. While the world hunted Nazis in uniforms and medals, the killers in nurse caps were forgotten. Society wanted to tell itself that women were the victims, the onlookers, the ones who didn't know, but they knew, and many chose to participate. After the war, some former SS nurses married, had children, lived ordinary lives in suburbs, laundering white sheets while the ghosts of their past screamed beneath their floorboards. They enjoyed birthdays and holidays and laughter, while the people they murdered were left without graves. One survivor said, "It felt like the world moved on, and we were the only ones who remembered the dead." Decades later, historians uncovered evidence, photographs, testimonies. But by then, many of the perpetrators were too old to stand trial, too sick to face prison, or already in the ground, buried with peaceful headstones, their crimes slowly erasing with time. Some who were finally confronted showed no regret. One former nurse insisted until her last breath, "I did nothing wrong." The chilling truth is this: justice did not win. History did not balance the scales. Most of these women faced no real punishment, not for mass murder, not for torturing the vulnerable, not for turning hospitals into factories of death. Instead, the burden of memory fell on the survivors and on us, the ones who tell their stories now. Because if society forgets, if accountability fades, then the idea that medical violence can be justified might return again. The uniforms changed, the hospitals reopened, but the question remains: how many hands that once delivered death went on to cradle newborns? How many eyes that watched children suffocate later watched their own children grow? War criminals became neighbors, grandparents, trusted citizens, their past erased, their smiles rehearsed, their silence unpunished. Not every monster slept behind bars. Some tucked themselves into clean beds in peaceful towns and dreamed of nothing. But the world moved on. The victims, however, never forgot. While everyone else was rebuilding, they were still trapped in sterile white rooms where nightmares were disguised as medicine. For them, hospitals were no longer places of healing, but corridors of fear. Some survivors say the scent of disinfectant still freezes their breath. A nurse's gentle footsteps still echo like the march of death. A needle in the arm still brings back the terror of poison labeled as treatment. They grew up, but their childhoods never did. Many were just children when the nurses came. Little boys and girls with learning difficulties, illnesses, disabilities, or simply born into families the Nazis deemed unfit. They didn't understand why the woman in a white coat smiled at them one moment and strapped them to a bed the next. There are stories of children lying awake at night pretending to sleep, just so they wouldn't be noticed by the nurse making her rounds. Some remember the bright light, the cold metal table, the mask held too tightly over their faces, the injections that burned. They remember friends disappearing one by one. They asked, "When will they come back?" No one answered, because the nurses made sure they never would. Those who survived carry a guilt etched into every heartbeat. Why me? Why not them? One woman, now elderly, recalls her roommate, a girl with a beautiful singing voice who laughed every morning. A nurse said she would be taken for a special trip to the garden. She never came back. The room was quiet forever. Survivors testify that they were treated not as children, but as statistics, as errors, as burdens to be erased. Some say they were told, "You should be grateful. We're helping you by helping Germany." They didn't understand the words then, they understand them far too well now. Others survived because a nurse showed mercy, or hesitated, or simply forgot them on a list. Those tiny accidents became the difference between life and death. Imagine growing up knowing your survival was a mistake. Decades later, many survivors still cannot trust a doctor, still panic when they see a uniform, still tremble during checkups, still ask, "What are they going to do to me?" Therapists call this trauma. Survivors call it living. Some tried to bury the memories, start new lives, raise families, and smile again. But every time their own children got sick, the fear returned. Every hospital visit, every syringe, every surgery was a battlefield in their minds. There are survivors who testified in courtrooms. Their voices shook, but they spoke. They hoped the truth would punish the guilty. But many times, those they accused walked free. Survivors left with tears, nurses left with smiles, and justice remained a ghost. Many were told to stay silent, to move on, to forget. But forgetting would mean killing the memory of all those who never had a voice. Some survivors spent their entire lives searching for documents, trying to find out where their siblings were taken, where their parents died, where their childhood ended. Graves are still missing, names erased, bodies uncounted. Their biggest fear is not death. It's that the world will forget what was done to them under the symbol of the Red Cross, under the promise of care, under the hands of women who were supposed to protect them. One survivor said, "I forgive what happened to me, but I will never forgive that the world let them forget." Mothers who survived mourn the babies taken from their arms, told they were being cleaned, fed, weighed, vaccinated. They were being murdered out of sight. Some survivors stand every year at memorials that were once hospitals, reading names of those lost, lighting candles, placing flowers on cold stone walls. They speak so the silence does not win, because silence is where atrocities grow. Their testimonies are warnings, their scars are history written on skin, and every time they share what they endured, they are not just remembering, they are fighting. Fighting so that no nurse, doctor, or government can ever again call killing a medical duty. Fighting so humanity never repeats this sterilized form of genocide. In their words we hear truth. In their trembles we hear courage. In their tears we hear the voices of all those who never had the chance to cry. They survived so the world would know. The nurse who smiles can be the nurse who kills. The hospital hallway can lead to death. And the promise of care can become the weapon that destroys. The survivors still walk among us. Their memories are fading, but their message is clear. Never let hospitals become hunting grounds again. Never let medicine become a mask for murder. Never forget the victims whose stories were nearly erased. Their voices are all that remain, to remind us that healing hands once served horror, and that trust, once broken, is never truly restored. Medicine was meant to heal, but they used it to murder. The victims deserve to be remembered. Their names must never fade. If you believe these stories must be told, please share this video. The more people who know, the less chance we have of forgetting. Subscribe and join us again as we uncover more of history's darkest crimes. Thank you for listening.